Hello, and welcome to the Office of the Patriot. If you're a returning viewer, welcome back. My name is Myron Ybarra, and I'm your host. My last video sparked an interesting conversation with a viewer about personal responsibility in policing. The person I was speaking with believes that qualified immunity should be removed from law enforcement. Their position, and the position of a number of other people who believe the same, is that law enforcement should be held responsible for acts within the color of their authority that violate constitutionally protected rights of the public while on duty. And in truth, I believe the same. However, I also believe that there's a large disconnect between the reality of qualified immunity and the public perception of qualified immunity. So, what is qualified immunity? Well, according to Cornell Law School, qualified immunity is legal immunity from lawsuits against public officials, and in this case, that's peace officers. This legal immunity is narrow in scope and only applies when the officer does not violate clearly established statutory or constitutional rights. It does not apply to government agencies, only government officials. And therein lies the problem. Most people have the misconception that qualified immunity prevents them from filing suit against government agencies for allegations of violation of constitutional rights and or departmental procedures. And this is not true. Many people also believe that qualified immunity is the same as absolute immunity, and this too is not true. Absolute immunity provides protection from civil and criminal liability to judges and prosecutors to the point where they can engage in egregious misconduct as long as that misconduct doesn't violate the law. They're still liable for all criminal violations. In essence, qualified immunity is immunity from civil liability only when specific qualifiers are present. And that primary qualifier is good faith. Is the officer acting in good faith when using his or her police powers? Absolute immunity doesn't require these qualifiers, and contrary to popular belief, law enforcement does not enjoy the privilege of absolute immunity. Working in law enforcement has always been a risky proposition. The ultimate goal for every peace officer is to end their shift with the same amount of holes they started their shift with. And while that may seem easy at the surface, when you're faced with having to make split-second decisions that will affect your life and the lives of the people around you, day in and day out, you're bound to make mistakes, even when you follow law and your departmental policy. Qualified immunity takes this into account, much like many Good Samaritan laws that protect people from civil and criminal liability when they act to help a fellow citizen during an emergency. During the incident, if the victim comes to some unintentional harm, the Good Samaritan is criminally and civilly shielded, as they should be. However, let's make the assumption that qualified immunity has too many cons that outweigh the pros and should be abolished. But before I share my thoughts on that, what are your thoughts on doing away with qualified immunity? Go ahead and comment below. So, here's my prediction, or my speculation if you happen to disagree with me on what would happen if qualified immunity was removed. Immediately following the Supreme Court overturning its 1967 decision on qualified immunity, a significant number of peace officers would terminate their employment, not wanting to risk their assets, even if they weren't close to retirement. And I'm guessing that would be right about 50% as a conservative guess. And as a result of this loss of manpower, city, county, and state governments wouldn't be able to perform necessary policing functions with less than half of their original police force. So, recruitment would be ramped up. And recruitment would bring in some new faces, roughly 10 to 15% of the missing 50. However, that would still leave a significant personnel deficit. In that same period of time, civil suits against law enforcement officials and departments would increase about fivefold. And this would drive in the opening of a new niche market I call the color of authority insurance. And if I'm being completely honest, as a capitalist, I kind of like the idea. Plus, I like it because I came up with it. However, given the extremely large payouts that departments and law enforcement officials would likely see as a result of soft-on-crime judges and juries, premiums would roughly match that of malpractice insurance for surgeons, and that's roughly $30,000 to $50,000 per year. Given these huge premiums, city, county, and state and federal agencies that maintain peace officers would have to increase salaries commensurate to the cost of these policies and include higher monetary enhancements or enticements to recruit these new officers. I believe peace officer salaries would start at a low end of about $120,000 to $200,000 or over $200,000 a year for just entry-level positions. And this would cause taxes to increase at all levels of government. Also, given that the Supreme Court has already ruled that peace officers cannot be held liable for inaction that leads to injury or death, a large percentage of crimes against persons and property would likely go unanswered as a result of the extreme risk of civil lawsuits that officers would take by engaging these criminals. So, the end result would be a police force that is roughly 75 to 80% of capacity, given that government coffers can't afford to pay the salaries that would put them at 100% capacity. And further, law enforcement would likely only engage criminality that was a low risk to them, like public order crime. Ultimately, people would continue to be unsafe in their communities and poorer than they were prior to law enforcement losing qualified immunity. And it goes without saying that qualified immunity is a necessary component for governments to maintain a police force. Without it, cost overruns would bankrupt most city and county governments, and people would be at higher risk of being victimized. Qualified immunity is not a perfect concept, but it does manage to balance the need for public safety with our civil liberties. I want to thank you for tuning in to today's episode. If you enjoy what was presented today, please consider subscribing, smashing that like button, and sharing my channel on your social media. And as always, have a great day and stay safe out there.